So it's my great pleasure to introduce Professor Simon Dalby, who is the CIGI Chair of Political Economy of Climate Change at the Balsillie School of International Affairs, Waterloo, and Wilfrid Laurier. It's one of those long, signatures that you would have afterward. Formerly a professor of political economy and geography at Carleton University, where he was my MA advisor, and it's safe to say that much of my academic career I owe to him at some level. Prolific writer, he writes more than 5 articles a year, and he's published 5 books. And his newest, which is called Security and Environmental Change by Polity, came out in 2009. He's a political geographer and the co-founder of the term, Critical Geopolitics, and is the co-editor of the journal Geopolitics. He has his new project coming out, which isn't actually what he's going to be talking to you about today, is a $2.6 million shirk entitled Borders in Globalization. So look forward to research in that, which will be more relevant in the future, obviously. But until then, let's welcome Simon Dalby, who will be talking about environmental geopolitics in the 21st century. Thanks.
Thanks, Tristan. I should point out that I'm one of a massive collection of scholars in that shirk grant, but it does have it's a big project with a big acronym, as in Borders in Globalization. So I do rather like that joke. It's just getting underway, run out of global studies in UVic actually, but I've got the sustainability theme of that is my task. I have to think about borders and sustainability and such things. So this is actually in some ways a useful lead into that larger project. Well, it's not quite what I'm actually going to talk about because we're only just getting the logistics of that big project organised at the moment. Environmental Geopolitics in the 21st Century, a title which is becoming a little trickier. At least the first 2 words of it are becoming more and more tricky these days. But it holds up just a little longer, at least for the purposes of this talk. Let me start by juxtaposing 2 thinkers who in various different ways have made me think in ways that have opened up some of the lines of inquiry in what's coming. First, Bruno Latour, an inquiry into the modes of existence, a collection of jottings and notes and provocations that was published a little while ago. One of the delicious paragraphs in it is as follows. If geologists themselves, rather serious and stolid types, see humanity as a force of the same amplitude as volcanoes or even of plate tectonics, one thing is now certain. We have no hope whatsoever. No more hope in the future than we had in the past of seeing a definitive distinction between science and politics. It's Bruno Latour saying very nice things about geologists. The other stimulation for thought is, of course, Rob Walker. And in his After the Globe Before the World, he writes in typical Walker-esque style, our prevalent maps are elegant, highly detailed, and generally sufficient to forestall vertigo among the more privileged. But the dragons of the unknown world are no longer just decorous motifs in the margin. In fact, they increasingly suggest that it is becoming as futile to look for politics where it is supposed to be, as it is to look for the sources of lasting authority down the barrel of a gun. What both of these thinkers are getting us to think about is about the basic categories that we use in thinking about politics, where it is, and how it relates to other forms of knowledge. And as I will unpack in the rest of this talk, this kind of thinking is very troubling to anybody who has traditionally understood geopolitics to be about the territorial state understood in modern terms. We are living in a world which the environmentalists, courtesy of NASA, like to suggest it doesn't have any obvious boundaries. The blue marble photograph, NASA image 72722 from 1972, of the whole Earth is iconic for a world in which state boundaries are artifacts that are, well, just that, artifacts. This is home, according to a lot of the environmentalist arguments. The given context doesn't have the natural territorial boundaries. At least that was the argument from the early 1970s. This was the iconic image that made that suggestion. The assumption that this was the given context for humanity, however, is increasingly coming under scrutiny in all sorts of different ways. Because William Rudiman in particular has been making a whole series of arguments for the last 15, 20 years. This is I think it's the second paperback version of his book, in which he's arguing that in fact that context isn't nearly as given as we have usually understood it to be. The image on the front of the book, of course, suggests that humans are dramatically changing landscapes in all sorts of ways that his book then goes on to suggest have actually been more profound than until recently we have actually realized. Hence the subtitle, How Humans Took Control of Climate. All the fussing these days about climate change suggests a novelty to this. Rudiman's corrective is suggesting that in some crucial ways this actually goes back a long way. The blue marble photograph is something that we have changed more fundamentally than we have usually understood. You've all seen a variation on the so-called Keeling Curve. It's all over the newspapers. Well, if you haven't seen it, you haven't been paying attention in the last little while. The rising level of carbon dioxide, as measured at Mauna Loa. I used to give up on this. A few years ago, I just gave up. Everybody's seen it. Why show it again? And then, of course, I realized that actually I needed to look at that diagram a little more carefully. Because this, in fact, is the story of my life. If my mother's calculations had been correct and I hadn't been a little too enthusiastic to get on with proceedings, I would have appeared exactly at the moment at which they started measuring the carbon dioxide concentration in Mauna Loa as part of the International Geophysics Year, which is actually 18 months in 57 and 58. It is interesting to reflect on us changing, in this case, carbon dioxide levels, because the argument that is increasingly making traditional understandings of geopolitics very difficult is just how artificial and how changed the human context actually is becoming. Any of you ever looked at this graph and figured out how many parts per million the Earth's atmosphere was the year you showed up? It is very interesting. If you look at the end of the Cold War, we were about 355 parts per million. We crossed 400 clearly back in May. The Mauna Loa readings, May 9th this year, registered 400. The speed at which we are changing one of the crucial trace gases in the atmosphere is quite noticeable. And, you know, the end of the Cold War is here. A couple of years earlier, 350 parts per million was basically the Brundtland Commission common future. If you go back to the oil crisis, which supposedly got us all worried about limits to growth and so on, we were about 327, 328 parts per million. The dramatic change is in our lifetimes. It just happens to be that that's more or less precisely mine. We are seeing very obvious changes in sea level. The point of all of this is that human activity is taking many of the taken for granted categories of our existence and changing them in subtle but increasingly important ways. This may not appear to have much to do with borders, but there are some delightful maps showing what will happen to maritime boundaries. The particular one I like is between Florida and Cuba as sea levels rise, because of course the Florida coastline will recede far more rapidly than the Cuban coastline, so the maritime boundary will, if it is going to bisect from coastline to coastline, gradually gravitate north, probably to the considerable irritation of the American Navy. There are other fascinating little examples. There used to be an ongoing controversy between Bangladesh and India about a low-lying island, but 2 or 3 years ago they went out to survey it again to actually, get the demarcation of that border sorted, and they couldn't find it. Rising sea levels have actually removed some controversial demarcation disputes quite simply by washing away sandbars that might be or might not be islands in various places. In that very simple practical example of changing the context is in fact changing borders in all sorts of odd ways. every now and again in this academic business you get lucky. This is actually an image that is published in a piece I had earlier this year in RUSI Journal, the Royal United Services Institute Journal, the big defence think tank in Britain. And they found this photograph, and the editor, without consulting me, put this photograph in. A four-wheel drive truck slows as it approaches a stretch of coastal road damaged by Hurricane Sandy, Hatteras Island, October 2012. I mean, in terms of glorious understatements, that has to take the cake. It's just absolutely perfect. The road ahead is going to be a little bumpy. This much is entirely clear. What has caused climate change, and in this case, the boundary between the maritime and the terrestrial worlds to get disrupted is, of course, in part, precisely these kinds of vehicles. That image I just love, and the understated caption, which I wish I'd thought of, but I didn't, just seems to me to capture so many things so perfectly. We are facing changed circumstances. We are actively changing those circumstances. And this is why that notion of environment is actually quite tricky, because increasingly the environment is an artifact of human activity. And we need to be very clear about the fact that it is no longer that given natural context on which we traditionally drew lines. But it isn't just a matter of climate. In terms of what kinds of boundaries and mappings of our condition we might draw up now, the ecologists are increasingly arguing that it isn't just about climate, it's about all sorts of other things which may have climatological effects. This is partly Rudimann's argument about how humans took control. This is an attempt to remap the biomes as the natural ecology of the planet used to be categorized cartographically into what are now increasingly called anthromes. We have built those roads in all sorts of strange places. Those are no longer natural coastlines in the sense that they were given to humanity by either a divine creator or the processes of geology, or however you wish to interpret these things. The point about this is the human imprint on the landscape has dramatically changed the natural, post-last ice age, distribution of species, which used to be clustered into things called biomes, and increasingly the argument from people like Earl Ellis and collaborators is that we have to understand the planet as a series of anthromes, as these artificial ecologies, assemblages of different elements which have dramatically shaped the ecology, so that taken for granted environmental backdrop to humanity is no longer understood as such, but is rather one that we have been actively creating, such that the boundaries, if not the borders, certainly the boundaries between what is understood to be natural and human, which we've traditionally mapped in terms of wildlands and biomes and so on, is just simply not the appropriate contextualization within which we now need to understand our current human condition. There's all sorts of details on this, but the crucial point is, as things become more recent, the landscapes dominated by human activity become ever more widespread, and for that matter more intense. All of which suggests perhaps a rather different understanding of the evolution of the human condition. The folks in the Earth system sciences are increasingly talking about the period basically that was charted on the Keeling Curve of carbon dioxide, basically since the 50s, as what they now call the Great Acceleration. The argument here is that the speed of the transformation of the planet is accelerating rapidly, not just the climate change. And this is an attempt that Will Steffen uses this diagram repeatedly, and he's one of the key thinkers in the whole discussion of Earth system science and the discussion of the Great Acceleration. He uses this not because the cube is necessarily particularly sort of three-dimensional representation of what's happening, but because these three things of the rapid increase in Earth's population, the rapid increase in the number of technological innovations, and then the attempt by the economists to actually measure the amount of things that are made, the amount of services that are provided, the amount of stuff and activities that humanity does. The argument here is that since the Second World War, we have accelerated this dramatically, not just in the carbon dioxide emissions, which are clearly showing up in that Keeling Curve graph, but in terms of the sheer number of things that we now make, the sheer number of us, obviously, but also the rapidly increasing size of the global economy. Which suggested to the cover designers of The Economist magazine a couple of years ago that the blue marble was not a very accurate representation of our context. We are literally remaking so much of the planet that this was their attempt to suggest that we have transformed so many of the Earth system processes that we now actually live in the era that is simply called, increasingly, the Anthropocene. And of course, this is precisely this discussion that Bruno Latour's quote that I opened with is referring to. Because the sheer transformation of the planet is of such a scale that we have now crossed the borderline from what used to be called the Holocene, which was sort of the fairly stable ecological circumstances of the last 10,000 years since the last glaciation. And the argument increasingly now is that, in fact, the geological timescale has to be updated because we've crossed that crucial border where we can no longer claim that the natural processes on the planet's surface are driven by, natural processes. The artificial human dimension of this is of such a scale that the geologists are increasingly talking about living in the Anthropocene. The point about this is simply the scale of human activity requires us to recognize this in terms of how the history of the planet is now to be told. Of course, being scientists, there's absolutely no consensus on when the Anthropocene might be said to begin. And indeed, one of the really interesting arguments all the way through stratigraphy, which is the history of the geographical of the geological history of the planet, the stratigraphy being the geological layers of rock laid down. They need a golden spike, as it's sometimes called. The Canadians have trouble with this notion of a golden spike. It usually refers to railway lines. No, the geological golden spike, of course, is the marker that is the boundary between the different geological epochs. And of course, there's a big discussion, well, is it actually late 18th century? Can we argue that the transformation was begun by the Industrial Revolution? I tend to like the latter part of the 1840s when steamships and railways began to actually speed up the moving of stuff around quite dramatically, and that's the crucial technology. But I think I'm going to be outvoted on claiming the 1840s are actually the more significant one, simply because it put everything in motion. The beginning of the Great Acceleration, round about 1950, is of course geologically marked very, very clearly by the appearance of artificial radionuclides as a result of nuclear weapons. And that is very clearly showing up in sediments right around the planet. So in geological terms, actually, the Anthropocene beginning at that moment has a very clear geological marker. Because the artificial products of nuclear fission are in the ecosystem. They're showing up in sediments everywhere. Therefore, so the argument might be that that's the golden spike, the border between the epochs clearly marked with something that can be found. This goes back over Ruddiman's argument. Part of the reason I put it up here is this is one of, as far as I can figure it out, there's 3 journals on the Anthropocene starting this year alone. So this is clearly catching on very much as a new way of contextualizing the human condition. There's Anthropocene Review, and there's another one, the title of which I've now forgotten, which has recently popped up. This is talking about all sorts of different dimensions of this border between the Holocene, the previous geological epoch, and the current one. What is quite remarkable is that although this discussion has been ongoing now for quite a few years, I actually just went back and looked, and I actually first used the term Anthropocene in 2003 in a conference paper, a year after it was first introduced. But if you look at the discussions of geopolitics as conventionally understood, what is quite remarkable is how books like this one fail to grapple with this transformation in the human circumstances. If you read the piece about climate change in Zachariah, and I don't know whether any of you have, there's an incredible break right after a couple of paragraphs of saying, rapidly increasing climate change is going to da-da-da-da, and then he just stops. He's obviously no idea how to cope with this, and goes on to other things about the glories of American culture and industrial innovation and all the other things that Zachariah finds so compelling. The concern, of course, is that Uncle Sam is being chased by bears and dragons and of course the Indian elephant too. The competition, the whole scheme of what really matters in geopolitics collapses back after that tentative recognition early in the text that climate change and the material transformation will have profound effects, back to the traditional question of great power rivalries. One of the exceptions, partially nearly, is actually Robert Kaplan's discussion of monsoon, because he's actually discovered when he's dealing with monsoons he'd better actually mention climate change every now and again. Of course, the following one on the revenge of geography managed to completely forget that he'd said climate change actually really matters in monsoon. The inconsistency between those volumes is particularly noteworthy. One of the things that is very interesting about Kaplan is his love affair with the American military. And although one might not expect it, one of the places where climate change has been taken very seriously in the last few years is at the heart of the American military. This is for a bunch of reasons. One thing that they began to realize was that many of the casualties caused by those things that for some reason or other we're still supposed to call improvised explosive devices. Bomb is an awful lot easier to say, but nonetheless, in the American invasions of both Iraq and Afghanistan, they were losing a lot of casualties, a lot of vehicles to IEDs. A lot of those were actually fuel convoys, because the Americans insisted on having diesel-powered generators in all their forward operating bases, and lugging vast quantities of water and diesel fuel around was actually making them incredibly vulnerable. This is logistically a nightmare for the American military. And they suddenly realized, well, actually, if we put solar panels on the roofs of those forward operating bases, if we put solar panels on the roofs of all our hangars, and the power does go out in either a storm or because of an attack, we've actually still got some power at least right on site. And suddenly, some years ago, they decided that solar was the way to go for reasons that would actually improve operational effectiveness. Therefore, suddenly, people started to pay a whole lot of attention. Ironically and interestingly, the American Navy in particular got into a huge fight over the last few years with their putative Republican allies in Congress, who were furious with them trying biofuels, furious with them experimenting with non-petroleum sources of jet fuel. It is more expensive, and good Republican cost cutters weren't having any of that. The Navy wanted to actually experiment with all of these things, figuring that actually being dependent on, again, those massive long oil supply lines from strange places was actually making them more vulnerable. And they actually were trying to fly planes using biofuel, hence Biojet 1 here. Now, I don't want you to get too enthusiastic about how green the American military is. As you will see in the next slide, quite a bit of it remains nothing more than a promissory note. But the point about this is that they're actually taking it very seriously. They are the people that will have to deal with the disasters. They are the people that will have to deal with the maritime border disputes. They are the people that will be called upon to rescue people being inundated from storms, particularly across the Pacific. And the Pacific Command has been paying some attention to this simply because the complex humanitarian emergencies that followed on from the big tsunami in 2004, then the Japanese one, 7 years later, got their attention. The realization that some of the Pacific atolls on which Americans have military facilities are going to get inundated increasingly also got their attention. So beginning to think about these things and beginning to realize that, in fact, climate change is going to be a threat multiplier in all sorts of ways, not least because it is changing borders in various ways. Will it lead to climate wars? Well, Gwyn Dyer, and this is the cover from his book. God, is it really 5 years ago? I guess it is. Gwyn Dyer actually went and talked to the American military that were back in 2007 when they were suddenly getting seriously concerned about these things. He's got a particularly chilling scenario about how this climate change might actually cause wars if people fail to anticipate the difficulties. Particularly the case that he works through in an alarming scenario is, of course, water resources and the disputes between India and Pakistan about this. The point about this, of course, is that, and here's where borders and environment matter hugely, of course, is that the river systems are cross-cut by the Pakistan-India border. And if there are attempts to grab water supplies as the monsoon gets increasingly disrupted, therefore there are scenarios in which this might be seen as a hostile act requiring military intervention, and hence the real danger of crossing the threshold into a nuclear war. It is worth pointing out, of course, that this in some ways is not a new discussion. Part of the attempt to get our heads around climate change was driven in the 80s by the discussion about nuclear winter. One of the byproducts of a nuclear war would be the lofting of vast quantities of dust, soot and smoke into the high atmosphere from multiple nuclear explosions, which is why I use this image rather than the standard image of a nuclear weapon, which is usually a singular explosion. The point about nuclear weapons is if they will be used in multiples with all sorts of ecological consequences. And of course, one of the issues that Gwyn Dyer is concerned about is if the Pakistanis and the Indians can't update the Indus Treaty, which about the water in usage in that region, which despite 3 or 4 wars is still intact pretty much. What it doesn't have is provisions that allow for rapidly changing ecological conditions to be accommodated. The presuppositions are that you get a fairly steady supply of water which you can divvy up according to fairly standard formulas. Of course, what matters in terms of climate change is when those circumstances don't actually hold and you get fluctuations. Who makes the determinations as to how much water each entity uses in circumstances that are outside the parameters assumed by the original treaty agreement. The point here is that the ecology and geopolitics are tied into each other in all sorts of different ways. The answer is no, of course. Because once the dust and soot had fallen out of the atmosphere, the carbon dioxide that was causing global warming would still be there. You might get some temporary cooling, but it isn't actually going to make a difference. You've got to have a few bad jokes every now and again in a talk. What is probably much more worrisome, however, is the kind of analysis of climate wars, same title as Gwyn Dyer, but this is Harold Welcher's book, written in German in 2008 or whatever. The dust storm, obviously, here. The analysis there suggests, using some rather chilling analogies with the rise of Nazi power in the 30s in Germany, which is actually Welcher's primary scholarly concern. He has a very chilling analysis in this book about how the Nazis actually consolidated their power, and in the process in the 30s changing what was taken as the benchmarks of what was normal in society. Analogies with Canada in the last decade suggest themselves, but I'll not go there. The point about what he's suggesting is that growing concerns about storms, growing concerns about extreme events, growing concerns about droughts and about floods, which we are seeing all through the media for good reason, because clearly they are becoming more severe, and they are certainly impacting in all sorts of new and violent ways over the last couple of decades. Concern that becomes the new normal, in which violent responses to these disruptions are then justified. What he's concerned about is we will get low-level violence in many parts of the world as a response to the social disruptions caused by climate change. It won't be necessarily the kind of environmental scarcity causing conflict stuff that my colleague Tad Homer-Dixon led the way examining back 2 decades ago. What it may well be is a series of sort of metropolitan violent interventions in the global south. And indeed, if you look at some of the maps that link environment and security in NATO and the OECD and various related agencies, you do indeed see marginal areas being identified as potentially environmentally vulnerable in ways that will cause all sorts of disruptions requiring political and military action in particular to contain the instabilities. Kazakhstan, Ukraine. These are the areas that supposedly have vulnerable environments which will require security interventions of some sort. Remapping the world into metropolitan prosperity and ecological insecurity, threatening metropolitan security. And the borders between the areas that are secure and those that are not secure are being mapped and remapped. You can pick dozens of these. This one happens to be one that keeps popping up in, well, I do various image searches and so on. Which brings us to the larger questions of geopolitics in terms of how those borders will actually be drawn. This is a lovely little graphic from an Economist magazine a long time ago, looking forward into this millennium and making it clear that how it was that those borders would be drawn was in fact crucial. I like to claim that somebody in the Economist magazine finally got around to reading some critical geopolitics in the 90s and came up with this as a consequence. But more seriously, how it is that those borders are drawn, where the lines are drawn, matters, because we seem to have got into a habit of making fences in all sorts of strange places of late. This is, of course, the Arizona desert. I love this image in the kind of way that you love something you hate, if you know what I mean. Because at least in theory, this fence is designed with a whole series of vertical sections so that it can ride up and down as the sand dunes blow, which suggests that the sand can move across the frontier, but animals and people can't. And there's something immensely ironic about building a fence that allows the landscape to change, but not allows the inhabitants of the landscape to move with it. And this image seems to capture the reimposition of an old fence-building territorial mode of governance on a world that is rapidly changing. So rapidly changing that in fact they can't put a concrete foundation under the fence. They have to build it so that it'll ride as the sand dunes move through the desert areas. It does seem to me that as a metaphor for changing environments, but rigid territorial modes of control being reasserted, this is about as good an image as you can get. Couple it with The Children of Men, the British movie a few years ago. Any of you seen The Children of Men? Oh yeah. What caught my attention in The Children of Men is this abject other reduced to this category of the fugee. It's no longer even refugees, it's just the fugee, as the migrant threatening, in this case, British territorial sovereignty or whatever. And how it is that people observe the other as that distant, threatened other that then becomes the threat because they are coming here, suggested to me all sorts of new ways of observing the world before I paid any attention to the construction of institutions such as Frontex and so on, who are, of course, dealing with the population movements in various parts of the world. States are observing and thinking about what images are part of that larger cultural repertoire of danger. It seems to me to be one of the other things that we need to pay a whole lot more attention to in coming times. Not least because of paying attention to Bertansky's brilliance. This is actually a 2003 photograph of Bertansky that is actually California. To bring you back to the theme of the Anthropocene and changing landscapes, I mean, this is what is causing the climate change, but it's also dramatically changing the landscape, moving people inevitably, both directly to allow the wells to be dug, but also indirectly, of course, by the product of those wells. The images that we draw out, the measurements that we make, are key to where the borders are now actually drawn. In one way, this is new. Perkins reminds us about satellite imagery, about calibrating how environments work, with all of the calculations about Soviet wheat demands and the international food market in the 70s and 80s. North Korea watchers are still doing it, trying to figure out how many poor unfortunate North Koreans will die this year, given the state of the agricultural situation in North Korea. But it does seem to me that all of this raises a series of questions about what it is that we are actually now thinking about in terms of geopolitics, because clearly it isn't just those territorial borders. Clearly it isn't just a matter of the rivalries of the great powers, however much Zachariah and Kaplan and Barnett and a whole bunch of those other people that I like to complain about are focusing on. Clearly there's a new materiality to geopolitics in the Anthropocene, which requires us to stop and think a little more carefully about borders and boundaries in new, novel circumstances. Stuart Eldon, this piece was the political geography lecture in Edinburgh in, when was it, July last year. Stuart suggests that conventional cartographic assumptions of borders and territorial states was what he called flat geopolitics. And his argument here in this paper was actually we need to think about the depth of power, hence secure the volume is a play on the normal police practice of secure the area. Standard security, something happens, an incident of some sort, secure the area is the standard command. It's a territorial strategy for control. But his argument, of course, is, and he uses the examples on the border between Israel and Lebanon in particular, looking at both tunnels and airspace, trying to argue that, in fact, geopolitics needs to be understood not just as a two-dimensional, but very much as a three-dimensional understanding of how power works through airspace, through tunnels, through infrastructure, through increasingly cyber connections in a way that isn't obviously flat geopolitics traditionally understood. Because, of course, my argument in extending that would be that, indeed, some of the crucial volumes that matter in geopolitics are, in this case, the Arctic sea ice volume. There's a lot of discussion about when the sea ice is actually going to disappear and the fluctuations. What's more interesting than the area is actually the volume, because it's not just the area covered by Arctic ice, but the trend is much clearer when you actually look at the volume, the depth of the ice, multiplied, of course, by the area that's actually covered by Arctic ice. 2013 wasn't quite as severe a loss as 2012, although I haven't actually seen the final tally on that yet. But the point here is that, again, thinking about a volumetric measurement rather than just the flat geopolitics matters. And of course, in the case of the Arctic ice, there are all sorts of questions here about the relationship between what is solid and what is liquid. Terrestrial and maritime domains get very complicated when you've got semi-permanent walkable surfaces, shall we call it that, i.e. the sea ice, which comes and goes. Therefore, the questions of how you do borders and how you actually deal with the Arctic is one of those interesting things, all related to the measures of volume of ice. We are also, of course, thinking about volumes in terms of water. No, that isn't Calgary or High River in Canada. It isn't even Katrina. This is personal in a different way. This is Dalby, Queensland, which got badly flooded a few years ago. Okay, it's another bad joke, but it did get my attention, all right? This is personal, right? The volumes of water, trying to look at how the displacements and so on are causing increasingly disruptions of artificial infrastructure. But it is also suggesting very clearly that our land use planning sucks badly. We are building all sorts of things in all sorts of places. Why would you build beside the river in a town called High River anyway? Well, of course, you build for property reasons, you build for pricing reasons, you build for land use decisions that are not taking into account high rivers at all. We do, after all, live in a neoliberal planet in many ways. Planet cooperation drives many of the land use decisions, drives many of the issues that need our attention, and indeed is increasingly driving how we try to govern climate. Yes, that's another bad joke, driving climate change, because fossil fuels and vehicles and things, you get it. Okay, good. The point about what Matt and Peter are doing here is looking at how it is that climate is actually transforming the global economy. All of the discussions about carbon markets, all of the discussions about the pricing of carbon, about cap and trade, about ecological services, ecological sinks, and the clean development mechanism related to the UNFCCC and so on, are all increasingly market-driven mechanisms. In a neoliberal world, the market is the mechanism for rule in so many different ways. Most particularly, they argue in terms of climate and capitalism. It is interesting to note that Christian Parenti is very clear in his discussion on climate change and the new geography of violence to suggest that how it plays out in those vulnerable areas that I showed you with the earlier maps, the NATO map of environment and security, and Ukraine and Kazakhstan as the violent, destabilized places that would cause insecurity in various forms. Parenti, of course, points out that it's precisely the mechanisms of market that are changing the agricultural landscapes across the global south that is in fact the context within which climate change is now playing out. And it's in that new political economy of neoliberal agriculture, as it were, that the transformations have to be understood as playing out. It isn't the given environmental context, it's that one that has been remade into anthromes of various sorts that matters. In the process, of course, of doing the calculations about carbon, there is all sorts of new boundaries and borders being generated. We now have all sorts of carbon offsets. These are well, I'll be careful here because I tend to dismiss them a little too quickly, perhaps. Offsets are basically ecological services where carbon will be sunk into ecosystems somehow or other, or where carbon emissions will be foregone. If you pay me, I will promise not to build another coal-powered plant or whatever. And the transactions that go with this are generating a whole new series of spaces. Not only the volume of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, but also the new mappings of forestry, not in terms of trees, but in terms of the amount of carbon they will actually sequester. So we have now got a whole new series of, in this case, calculations done by various complicated mathematical formulas applied to geographic information systems. If you put a polygon around this chunk of territory and it's got so many trees and whatever, we can claim that it will sequester so much carbon over the next 20 years. Therefore, we can market its ecological services. But all this requires drawing those polygons around areas, calibrating, calculating, and certifying that they actually have got these particular ecological services, and then those are in turn marketed in the new logics of carbon markets. The point Lansing is making here is that in some ways these are often arbitrary borders. The geographies on the land bear little resemblance to the traditional Costa Rican forestry management districts, much less to the traditional modes of life of the people that actually live in these new polygons. But nonetheless, in terms of being a mode of rule and in terms of ways that determine the kind of forestry management practices that have to be undertaken in those areas to meet the certification, then we have a whole new series of geographies, of categories of property that have particular qualities that can then be marketized. And indeed, this is part of the larger discussion of land grabs, what Saskia Sassen recently simply called feeding the dissembling of the national territory. Because it isn't just the polygons of the new carbon offsets, which are the new territories of climate. It's also the fact that many states and big corporations are thinking, well, climate change is actually coming. Particularly the Persian Gulf states, the Saudis in particular, are running out of water in those aquifers that they have been pumping to feed their population. Fly over that part of the world and you see these huge, great, big irrigated fields right in the middle of the desert. Well, guess where the water's coming from? Out of the ground, and it's not going to be there forever. Where are we going to feed our population from? Large purchases of agricultural land across various parts of the south are feeding this. One that caused quite a bit of fuss earlier this year was actually India buying up a whole bunch of territory in Ethiopia without any consultation with the local residents. This was going to become an agricultural source for feeding India, regardless of what the local Ethiopians might actually say. And it's precisely who is controlling which chunks of territory, the land grabs and the new political economy of land markets, particularly in Africa, is driving suggestions by Sassen and other people that we now have got a disassembly of national territories and a reassembling of all sorts of bits and pieces of real estate of one form or another in the south, which is being ruled not by the local capital more, but by these international agreements, whether it's for the extraction of resources or for the sinking of carbon. All of which gives us a much more complicated series of geographies, which suggests to the folks looking at environment and security, which is stuff I do, as you know, that in fact the traditional assumptions about environment causing conflict are actually missing the point. Thinking about parenti, thinking about the Anthropocene, thinking about how the various international efforts at climate mitigation and so on are playing out. In fact, the backdraft, to use the Wilson Center argument, is that in fact those adaptation measures may in fact be causing more conflict than the climate change itself. And unless we get the policies right about how we mitigate and adapt to climate, we may actually be, by foolishly doing land grabs, by foolishly doing allocations of carbon credits and things regardless of the local preferences, we may end up generating conflict by simply assuming all sorts of strange technocratic responses are the appropriate way to redraw various boundaries in the current attempt to respond to what is obviously an increasingly volatile climate. If those things don't work, of course, then the argument is, well, we're going to have to get serious about the next stage, which is, of course, geoengineering. Clearly, we're going to have to cool the planet. Obviously, everybody insists on driving those stupid V8 trucks, even if the road ahead is bumpy. Therefore, we have got all sorts of emission problems. Carbon lock-in means we will go on doing this for a long time. Therefore, we're simply going to have to artificially cool parts of the planet, or perhaps the whole planet, inject huge amounts of sulfate aerosols into the upper atmosphere. If you do it in certain places, you may be able to change cloud patterns. You may be able to change the albedo effect of the upper atmosphere in ways that will actually partially shade the planet. Of course, once you actually start getting into thinking through the climate models and what effects one state doing it might have on others, the conflict potential is huge. But again, the problem is that this doesn't follow the logic of national boundaries in terms of the consequences, even if the decision-making about it from a state facing particularly severe climate change might be that it is in our national interest to change the global climate. And of course, if you simply need to fly a couple of dozen Boeing 747s around in the upper atmospheres all the time, pumping stuff out the back end of the plane, it's within the industrial capabilities of medium-sized states to do this. Branston and Gates and a few other, are they gazillionaires, billionaires, whatever they are these days? They've got so much money you can't count it anymore. It's within their capabilities too. Should they unilaterally decide to start to fly large numbers of planes around doing this kind of stuff? This is how the debate is now playing out. And again, the questions of borders and territories in terms of how we govern climate become ever more complicated. And if one state objects to another state's doing this, we've got all sorts of conflict potentials too. which is why so many people are adamantly opposed to experiments with geoengineering. Hands-off Mother Earth works rather well as an insistence on protecting home. The point is that these experiments are being thought about seriously now, and the debate about geoengineering has taken off in the last couple of years. I'm talking about it tomorrow morning on a Skype call to Brussels as it happens. The point that I want to make there and want to make to you today is that this is actually hopelessly out of date. There isn't a given environment which we should take our hands off. We've already transformed it in all sorts of ways, albeit frequently not deliberately. And of course the definition of geoengineering is usually about deliberate attempts to manipulate the climate. We have changed the planet quite fundamentally. This is one of the more interesting new geological formations. We sometimes simply call them cities. The point is that this is a very novel geological formation. This planet has never seen anything like this before. And we need to understand ourselves as geological actors. We are, in fact, making some profound decisions about the future of the planet. It's a kind of question that doesn't make any sense. But that's actually what we're deciding. What do you mean? How many polarized caps should the planet have? Well, we are actually making decisions inadvertently about precisely the answer to this. We're heading rapidly towards one permanent one and one intermittent one as the ice melts in the Arctic. Remembering, please, that technically Greenland isn't over the pole, it's well south of the pole, although it's usually thought of as a polarized cap. Greenland is melting fairly quickly. Antarctica is another story. It's much bigger, much colder, and will take an awful lot longer to melt, if, in fact, we do melt it. But it's this kind of question that is mind-boggling. We've never asked these kinds of questions before, because the assumption has always been that humanity is separate from a given environmental context over which we have little control. That is no longer the case. Humanity has to make these kinds of decisions in terms of deciding the configuration of the planet in coming millennia. I remain unconvinced that this kind of gathering is actually likely to do a very good job anytime soon. Warsaw is coming in the next couple of weeks. I don't even remember the exact dates of it because I'm not paying much attention. Peru is in December of 2014, before the great big treaty negotiation in Paris in late 2015. We're on track to talk about how we are going to put some international governance regime together, but we have not yet figured out how you decide how many polar ice caps the planet should have. And territorial states, as the agents for making that kind of decision, may be a particularly ill-fitted institutional context for which these kinds of questions should be raised. I can't answer what kind of a treaty these folks should come up with. Personally, I'll take 2 polar ice caps. How do you decide? It doesn't actually matter. The planet has got along quite nicely in the past with none. The point for humanity, of course, is how quickly you would do the transition. If it takes 1 million years to melt Greenland, it doesn't matter, because we will gradually move. If it takes a couple of 100 years, it matters greatly, because our infrastructure is actually built on coastlines which are going to be submerged very shortly if we continue on the current trajectory we are on. How it is that the traditional geographical notions of territorial states as the appropriate mode of governance can be reformed, changed, modified to tackle the kinds of issues that we now face remains the big political question, it seems to me, for anybody who's interested in geopolitics. But it also really raises the question as to in what sense this term is still appropriate, because what we are doing is in many ways a new form of geological politics, which suggests that in fact environment as we've traditionally understood it might be increasingly irrelevant to a discussion of geopolitics in the 21st century. Thank you.